The night was dark and cold. The wide plains stretched far into the distance, and the only sound came from the wind moving through dry grass. Samuel, a quiet rancher who lived alone, sat near his wooden table sharpening a small knife. It was an old habit he kept from his younger days. He didn't use it for harm, mostly for cutting ropes or fixing things around the ranch. The lantern beside him gave a warm glow, showing the rough lines on his face and the loneliness in his tired eyes. He had worked hard since sunrise. A storm had passed a few days ago, breaking fences and scattering his cattle. He had spent all day repairing, feeding, and walking the land. When the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, he thought about getting some sleep. But before he could stand up, a faint sound broke through the still air. It was soft, unclear, like a voice carried by the wind. Samuel stopped moving and listened carefully. The sound came again, this time closer. It was weak, trembling, and filled with fear. He felt a shiver down his spine. Out here, miles from the nearest town, no one should be calling for help at this hour. He stood, grabbed his lantern, and opened the door. Cold wind rushed in. "Hello?" he called out into the darkness. No one answered, but then he heard it again. "Please, save me." The voice was small and desperate. Samuel's heart beat faster. He followed the sound, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The light from his lantern moved over the yard, over the barn, and toward the shadowed corner near the old fence. The night smelled of dust and wet hay. The closer he got, the clearer the voice became. It was definitely a woman's voice, tired, scared, and broken. He pushed open the barn door. The hinges creaked and the light stretched across the floor. He looked around, and then he saw her. A young woman was lying near a pile of straw, half hidden under an old blanket. Her hair was tangled, her face covered in dirt, and her clothes were torn as if she had run through the wild brush. Her breathing was shallow. Samuel froze in shock. He didn't know who she was or how she had reached his ranch. He knelt beside her carefully. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she looked terrified, then whispered, "Please, don't hurt me." He shook his head quickly. No, you're safe here," he said softly. "I won't hurt you. You're at my ranch." Her lips trembled as she tried to speak again. "They left me there. I ran, please." Samuel didn't ask more. He could see she was exhausted and frightened beyond words. He gently lifted her up, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She was freezing. He carried her to the main house and laid her down near the fireplace. He poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. Her hands shook as she drank. Then he warmed a bowl of soup and placed it in front of her. She ate slowly, as if she hadn't had food in days. He noticed her wrists were red and bruised, and her feet were cut from walking barefoot. Whoever she was, she had suffered something terrible. When she finished, she looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "You won't send me back?" she asked in a trembling voice. Samuel frowned. "Back where?" She looked away, tears gathering in her eyes. "They'll find me." "They always do." Samuel gently touched her shoulder. "No one's coming here. You're safe, I promise." He gave her a blanket and told her to rest. She fell asleep near the fire, her breathing steadying little by little. Samuel sat in his chair staring into the flames. He had many questions but decided not to wake her. He could ask in the morning. When dawn arrived, the sky turned orange over the fields. Samuel saddled his horse and rode into town to buy medicine and food. At the general store, he spoke quietly with a few townsfolk. One old man mentioned hearing about a wagon that was attacked down by the canyon road. Some travelers were missing. The sheriff had found a few broken wheels and burnt wood, but no survivors. Samuel's heart sank. He didn't know if the girl at his ranch was part of that tragedy, but something told him she was. When he returned home, she was awake and sitting near the window, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. She looked cleaner now, her hair brushed, though her eyes still showed fear. She smiled faintly when she saw him. "Feeling better?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "Yes, thank you. My name's Clara." Samuel nodded. "I'm Samuel. You're safe here, Clara. You can stay as long as you need." She hesitated, then began to speak softly. "I was traveling with a family from the east. They promised me work in a new town. On the way, some men attacked our wagon. They took our horses and they tied me up and left me near a canyon. I waited until night and managed to run away. I saw the light from your ranch. That's how I found you." Samuel felt his hands tighten into fists. The thought of such cruelty made him sick. "You did right by coming here," he said. "You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." For the first time, Clara seemed to relax. Her shoulders loosened and she gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Samuel," she whispered. That evening, while Samuel was fixing the barn door, he noticed his small knife, the one he had been sharpening the night before, was gone. He frowned. Maybe he misplaced it. He went back to the house to look, but when he entered, he froze. Clara was standing near the window, holding the knife tightly in both hands. Her eyes were wide and she looked terrified again. "Clara," Samuel said softly, raising his hands. "It's all right. You don't need that." Tears fell down her face. "They said they'd come for me," she whispered. "They said they'd find me if I ever ran." Samuel stepped closer slowly, careful not to frighten her. "No one is coming here," he said calmly. "This land is far from the roads. Nobody even knows you're here. I'll keep you safe." For a moment she didn't move. Then finally she let go of the knife. It dropped to the floor with a dull thud. She covered her face and began to cry. Samuel picked up the knife and placed it back on the table. He stood beside her quietly, giving her space to breathe. After a few moments, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you, I just don't know who to trust anymore." He nodded gently. "You don't have to be sorry. Fear does strange things to people. You've been through enough." That night, Clara slept peacefully for the first time since she arrived. Samuel stayed up by the fire, watching the shadows on the wall. Outside, the wind blew across the open plains and the dogs barked once before falling silent. He couldn't stop thinking about her words. They said they'd find me. He knew the land well, and he knew men who could do terrible things and vanish without a trace. He decided that if anyone came for her, they'd have to go through him first. As the flames in the fireplace burned low, Samuel leaned back in his chair. The world outside was quiet, but inside the house something had changed. A frightened stranger had entered his lonely life, and without knowing why, he felt responsible for her safety. Before he closed his eyes, he looked toward the sleeping girl. She looked peaceful now, her face calm in the firelight. He whispered to himself, "You're safe, Clara. You're safe now." Outside, the sky began to darken again, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, long, low, and haunting. Samuel didn't know that this peaceful night was only the calm before something much darker. The morning came with a red glow rising over the horizon. Samuel stepped outside, breathing in the cold air. The fields were quiet except for the sound of the windmill turning slowly. But something about the morning felt wrong. The horses were uneasy, moving restlessly in their pen. Samuel knelt down and noticed faint footprints in the dirt near the fence. They weren't his, and they weren't Clara's. Someone had been there during the night. He followed the prints for a few yards until they disappeared near the dry creek bed. Whoever it was had come close enough to see the house, then turned back. Samuel's chest tightened. He returned to the house quickly. Clara was sitting by the window with a worried look. She must have seen the worry on his face because she asked softly, "You went outside? Did you hear them too?" He looked at her carefully. "You heard something?" She nodded, her fingers gripping the blanket around her shoulders. "Footsteps. Last night. I didn't sleep much. I was afraid." Samuel sighed and nodded. "Someone's been near the ranch, but they're gone now. Don't worry, I'll keep watch." Days passed quietly. Clara grew stronger. She helped with small chores, feeding chickens and sweeping the floor. She smiled sometimes when Samuel joked about his stubborn horse or when he burned the biscuits again. Yet her fear never fully left. She still jumped at sudden noises and often stared at the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Samuel tried to keep her mind busy. He taught her how to feed the cattle, how to mend a torn glove, and how to make coffee strong enough to chase away tiredness. Slowly, the ranch began to feel less empty. But one afternoon, everything changed. Samuel was working on the fence again when he heard the sound of hooves. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor passing by. But then he saw them, 3 riders coming from the south. They rode hard and fast, dust rising behind them. Samuel's heart sank. He could tell from their posture that they weren't farmers or townsmen. He waited near the gate, his hand resting calmly on the fence rail. When the men stopped, the one in the front smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "Morning, rancher," the man said. "Fine place you got here." Samuel nodded politely. "Morning. What brings you out this far?" The man tilted his hat. "We're looking for someone. A young lady. Came from a broken wagon down by the canyon. Heard she might have wandered this way." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Haven't seen anyone like that," he said simply. The man's eyes narrowed. "You sure? She's small, brown hair, maybe a scar on her arm. Belongs to a friend of ours." Samuel felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his tone calm. "No one like that here. You should move on before the sun gets high. Water's scarce that way." The men glanced at one another. The leader smirked and spat into the dust. "Appreciate your time, rancher. We'll be back if we don't find her." They turned their horses and rode away slowly, leaving a trail of dust behind. Samuel stood there until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he hurried back to the house. Clara was standing behind the curtain, pale as paper. She had seen them. "They found me," she whispered. "They'll come back." Samuel shook his head. "Not if I can help it. They'll think you went another way." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. They won't stop." Samuel placed his hands on her shoulders. "Then I'll be ready for them. You're safe here." That night he loaded his rifle and kept it near his chair. The air outside was still. Even the dogs were quiet, as if they sensed something waiting beyond the dark. Clara sat near the fire, hugging her knees, staring into the flames. "Samuel," she said softly, "why are you helping me? You don't even know me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because no one should be left alone to fight something like this. Because once someone helped me too when I had nothing." Her eyes softened. "Then I'll never forget what you've done." They stayed awake for hours, the silence broken only by the crackle of burning wood. Then, just after midnight, the dogs began to bark, sharp and angry. Samuel stood up instantly and grabbed his rifle. He motioned for Clara to stay low and took the lantern. He stepped out onto the porch. The night was black except for the thin light of the moon. The wind was quiet now, almost holding its breath. Then he saw shadows moving near the barn. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer, only footsteps in the dust. Samuel walked forward slowly, his rifle raised. Then, out of nowhere, a figure rushed from the darkness. The lantern swung wildly in his hand as he stepped back and pulled his knife from his belt in reflex. The light flickered, and then he saw who it was. It was Clara. She was being dragged by a man who held her arm tightly. Her face was terrified, her hair loose and wild. "Samuel!" she cried out. For a moment, everything froze. The knife in Samuel's hand was raised, the light trembling. From where he stood, it looked like he was threatening her. His own heart stopped as he realized it. He stumbled back in horror, his hand shaking. "Clara." Before he could move, the man behind her tried to pull her toward the gate. Samuel dropped the knife and raised the rifle instead. He fired one shot into the air. The blast echoed across the fields. The man cursed, shoved Clara aside, and ran into the darkness. From the shadows near the barn, two more figures appeared, the same riders from earlier. They turned and fled. With him, their horses kicking up dust as they disappeared into the hills. The dogs barked wildly, chasing after them for a few yards before stopping. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Samuel rushed to Clara, who had fallen to her knees, trembling. He knelt beside her. "You're safe. It's over," he said softly. Tears streamed down her face. I thought you were going to hurt me," she whispered. "When I saw the knife." Samuel's throat tightened. "Never," he said firmly. "I'd never hurt you." He helped her inside, sat her down near the fire again, and handed her water. She couldn't stop shaking. He sat beside her in silence until her breathing calmed. When the morning light touched the windows, Samuel stepped outside again. The land looked peaceful, as if the night had been only a bad dream. but the footprints near the barn told the truth. He followed them to the edge of his land, where they disappeared over the ridge. He knew the men would not return soon. The sound of a rifle in the dark would make any outlaw think twice. A few days later, the sheriff from town came by. Samuel told him what happened, and the sheriff nodded grimly. "We caught a few drifters down by the border," he said. "Sounds like the same bunch. They won't bother anyone again." When he left, Clara stood quietly by the porch. Her eyes were soft, though a little sad. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "Yes. You can rest easy now." She looked out across the open fields. The wind carried the smell of grass and sun-warmed earth. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. Samuel smiled faintly. Sometimes safety finds us in strange places. Days turned into weeks. Clara stayed on the ranch, helping with chores, learning to ride, and laughing again. The fear in her eyes slowly faded. She began to hum while cooking, and sometimes teased Samuel about his stubborn mule. The ranch, once silent and lonely, felt alive again. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Samuel and Clara sat on the porch. The sky was painted orange and gold, the air still and warm. She turned to him and said quietly, "You saved my life that night." He shook his head. "No. You saved yourself by finding the strength to keep running." She smiled gently. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have made it if I hadn't found this place. If I hadn't found you." Samuel didn't answer right away. He looked out across the land, the fences standing firm, the cattle grazing, the windmill turning slowly against the fading light. For the first time in many years, he felt something close to peace. He turned back to her and said, "Then maybe we both got saved that night." Clara smiled, and the sound of her quiet laughter mixed with the whisper of the wind across the plains. The ranch that had once known only silence now held the soft sound of hope, and as the stars began to shine above them, Samuel knew that the memory of that night, when she begged for help and he nearly raised his knife in horror, would never leave him. It was the night fear turned into courage, and two broken lives found the strength to start again under the endless sky.